Dexter's code didn't fail because he broke it. It failed because it was never designed to work in the first place. And if you go back and watch the pilot with that in mind, you'll realize that Harry Morgan didn't create a moral framework for his son. He created a containment system for a problem he didn't know how to solve. And the difference between those two things is the difference between teaching someone to live and teaching someone to survive while causing the least amount of collateral damage. The Code of Harry is presented throughout the series as this elegant solution to an impossible problem, a way for Dexter to channel his dark urges into something that at least resembles justice. But the actual rules of the code reveal what it really is, which is a set of instructions for how to be a serial killer without getting caught. Rule 1, never get caught, which isn't about morality. It's about operational security. Rule 2, only kill people who deserve it, which sounds noble until you realize that deserve it is defined by Dexter's personal judgment, not by any actual legal or ethical standard. And that's not justice. That's just vigilantism with extra steps and a plastic wrap budget. Rule 3, have proof, which again is about covering your tracks, making sure that if anyone ever questions what you're doing, you have evidence that the person was bad. So it's still fundamentally about self-preservation disguised as moral certainty. But here's what makes the code truly insidious as a psychological construct. It gives Dexter an identity that explains his emotional distance, while simultaneously preventing him from ever examining whether that distance is actually real. Harry tells him from childhood that he's different, that he's broken, that he doesn't feel things the way other people do, and then he gives him a framework that makes that brokenness useful, even noble in a twisted way. Because if you're going to be a monster anyway, at least be a monster who kills other monsters. The problem is that Dexter isn't actually a psychopath in the clinical sense, and the show gives us evidence of this in nearly every season. But Dexter himself can't see it because the code has become the foundation of his entire identity, and questioning the code would mean questioning everything Harry taught him, everything he believes about himself, everything that makes him feel special rather than simply damaged. Let's talk about what Harry actually did when he created the code, because if you strip away the mythology that the show builds around it, what you're left with is a father who discovered that his son had killed someone, panicked, and instead of getting him actual psychological help, decided to turn him into a functional killer by giving him rules and rituals that would keep him out of prison. Harry was a cop, so he knew how killers get caught, and he used that knowledge to teach Dexter how not to get caught, which makes sense from a certain desperate parental logic. But it's not the same thing as teaching him how to live, and that distinction is everything. The code doesn't ask Dexter to examine his urges, to understand where they come from, to question whether they're really as uncontrollable as he's been told. It just tells him how to satisfy them in a way that won't destroy his life or the lives of the people around him, and that's management, not morality. And here's the thing that the show keeps showing us, but Dexter keeps refusing to see. He's not actually the emotionless monster he believes he is, and almost every significant relationship in his life is evidence of this. But he interprets all of that evidence through the lens of the code, which tells him that any human feeling he experiences is either fake, a learned behavior he's using to blend in, or a dangerous weakness that threatens to compromise his true nature. When he feels protective of Deborah, he tells himself he's just mimicking what a brother should feel. When he falls in love with Rita, he convinces himself of a perfect cover story, a wife and kids who make him look normal. When he risks everything to save Harrison, he frames it as instinct, the code's directive to protect innocent life, not as the action of a father who loves his son, because admitting that he loves his son would mean admitting that he's capable of love, and if he's capable of love, then maybe he's not the monster Harry told him he was. And if he's not that monster, then what has he been doing for the last 20 years? Every season gives us a moment where Dexter's humanity breaks through the monster narrative, and every season he finds a way to reinterpret that moment so it fits back into the code's framework. Season 1, he kills his brother not because Brian represents his dark urges, but because Brian threatens Deborah, and that choice, family over blood, connection over impulse, that's not a monster's choice. That's a human choice made by someone who's been taught to distrust his own humanity. Season 2, Lila sees through his mask, and he kills her not because she violated the code, but because she threatened to expose him to Rita and the kids, which means he was more afraid of losing his family than he was of breaking his rules. And again, that's not the action of someone who doesn't feel. That's the action of someone who feels deeply but has been convinced that those feelings are dangerous, untrustworthy, a lie he tells himself to blend in. Season 4 is where the show comes closest to forcing Dexter to confront this contradiction, because Trinity kills Rita, and Dexter's response to that loss is not cold calculation or detached analysis. It's rage and grief and guilt, the kind of emotional devastation that doesn't make sense if you're really just pretending to care about people. And yet, even here, even in the aftermath of losing someone he claims was just a cover story, he reframes the tragedy in terms of the code, convincing himself that Rita died because he let Trinity live too long, because he got distracted by his own curiosity, because he violated the rules. And that narrative is easier to accept than the truth, which is that Rita died because Dexter chose to have a relationship with her in the first place. That the code couldn't protect the people he loved because the code was never designed to let him love anyone at all. The original series ending understands this on some level, which is why it has Dexter fake his death and disappear, leaving everyone behind, because if he stays, if he keeps trying to have relationships while maintaining the code, more people will die, and he knows this. But the execution of that ending fails the character, because it presents this as noble self-sacrifice, Dexter removing himself to protect the people he loves, when the psychologically consistent version would be Dexter finally admitting that the code was the problem, that Harry's framework turned him into a killer when he might have been something else, and that the only way to stop the cycle is to stop believing the lie that he's fundamentally broken beyond repair. New Blood tries to correct this by having Dexter confront the consequences of his actions through Harrison, his son who inherited his darkness, or at least believes he did, because that's what Dexter taught him. And the ending where Harrison kills Dexter is meant to be poetic justice. The cycle ending with the son rejecting the code that the father lived by. But this ending also fails the character's psychology because it assumes that Dexter's only two options are to keep killing or to die, when the actual third option, the one the show never seriously explores, is for Dexter to stop believing he's a monster and get actual help, real therapy, honest examination of his trauma and what it did to him, not as a cover story or manipulation, tactic, but as a genuine attempt to become something other than what Harry made him. Because here's what a psychologically consistent ending would look like. Dexter realizes that the code was never about justice. It was about control. Harry's control over an impossible situation, and Dexter's control over his own fear being normal, being ordinary, being just another traumatized kid who watched his mother die and never processed it because his father told him he was special, different, broken in a way that made him dangerous rather than simply hurt. In this version, Dexter doesn't fake his death, and he doesn't get killed by his son. Instead, he turns himself in, not because the code demands it, but because he finally understands that the code was the thing keeping him trapped, and the only way to be free is to face what he's done without the mythology, without the ritual, without the story he's been telling himself about being a dark defender who channels his urges into righteous kills. He confesses to Deborah first, if she's still alive, or to someone who represents what Deborah meant to him, which is unconditional acceptance. And he tells the truth, which is that Harry was wrong, that the code was a lie, that he spent his entire adult life killing people because he was too afraid to find out what would happen if he stopped, if he actually sat with his feelings instead of drowning them in blood and plastic wrap. He explains that every person he killed might have deserved it by some measure, but that doesn't change the fact that he killed them to satisfy his own need, not protect anyone, not to serve justice, but because killing made him feel in control when everything else in his life felt like performance and pretense. And then he turns himself into the police, not dramatically, not as some grand gesture, but quietly, the way someone might finally admit they have a problem and need help they can't give themselves. And he does this knowing that he'll spend the rest of his life in prison, that he'll never see Harrison again, that every relationship he had will be destroyed by the truth. But he does it anyway because the alternative is to keep living the lie, to keep believing that the code made him better when all it really did was give him permission to keep doing what he was always going to do until someone stopped him. In this ending, Harrison doesn't become a killer because Dexter breaks the cycle by admitting the cycle was built on a foundation of self-deception and trauma that was never properly addressed, and Harrison gets to be angry, gets to hate his father for lying to him about what they were. But he also gets to be free of the narrative that he's doomed to be broken the same way. And that's the real tragedy that both endings miss, which is that Dexter could have saved his son by saving himself, by rejecting the code before it was too late. But he didn't, because rejecting the code would have meant rejecting Harry's love. And for all his talk about being a monster without feelings, Dexter's greatest fear was never that he would hurt people. It was that he would be alone, unloved, the kind of person that even his own father couldn't accept without turning him into something useful first. The code kept him trapped, not safe, and every version of the ending that treats it as anything other than a prison he built around himself with Harry's blueprints misses the point of who Dexter Morgan actually was underneath the mythology. Not a dark avenger, not a necessary monster, just a traumatized person who was taught to weaponize his pain instead of heal from it, and who spent his entire life proving his father right when he could have spent it proving him wrong.